talk about the kind of last two projects that I'm working on that are kind of overlapping. So one is looking at bilingual development and in Syrian refugee children. Canada had a resettlement program for Syrian refugee children, families who had children starting in 2015, and I was part of a cross-Canada group that looked at socio-emotional well-being and adjustment to school, and their learning, their maintenance of their Arabic heritage language, and their acquisition of the societal language, which in English Canada is English and French in Quebec. So that went on for 5 years, and I'm still working on that. We're still going through the data. Our goals were to understand what were the roots of resilience and vulnerability in this population, because refugee children are very vulnerable. They often have had a lot of adversity before resettlement, and they often live in poverty post resettlement on social assistance. So there's all kinds of interesting things that can affect their language and their learning and their adjustment at school. So that's a big project. And the most recent one is looking at children who have what we call in North America special needs at school. So these are children with communication disorders like autism, like developmental language disorder, also children who have hearing impairment, children who have problems articulating, children who use special communication boards, augmentative communication, because they don't use the verbal mode very often. And we're looking at kids who are have special needs, who come from first-generation immigrant families, and to understand and how the parents navigate the complexities of having a child with a disability in a new country, and understand how the children are learning the societal language, how they're maintaining their heritage language. So that project is ongoing. The first lecture was starting with what happens in bilingualism with children who learn two languages from birth, and sort of what are the issues. One of the big issues that has been pervasive in the field is that it is too difficult or challenging for children to acquire two languages right from birth, and that they'll be delayed or confused, and so monolingualism is perhaps better for younger learners. All of my research has shown that that is completely untrue, and that children can and do learn two languages simultaneously perfectly well without any compromising of their long-term language development or their cognitive development or social development or anything like that. In my second lecture, I talked about children who are what we call sequential bilinguals. So these are ones who have a first language kind of in place, and then they learn the second language usually either at preschool when they're about 4, or when they start school when they're about 5. So there's a sequence in their acquisition. And many kids who are in this category are from immigrant families. So I talked about how their trajectories in the societal language, how long it takes for them to acquire the societal language to become pretty much the same as their monolingual peers. The main thing is that people think it happens pretty quickly. And it doesn't. It can take like all of elementary school for them to, sort of be similar to their monolingual peers. But of course, they catch up at very different individual rates and so on. And my third lecture was about something I'm quite passionate about, which is sources of individual differences. So when you look at bilingual children, it's really hard to talk about them as a group. If you just gather a bunch of 5-year-olds who are monolinguals, say English monolinguals, and you look at their language abilities, they'll be a little bit different from each other. So they might vary like this, right? And if you take a group of 5-year-old bilinguals, you will get this. So they're just more heterogeneous, because they start learning their languages at different times. They sometimes have more exposure to one language than another. There's more complexities in their language learning experience and trajectories. So one of the things that we researchers do is we try to look at what factors account for that variation. So what predicts whether a child is way up here or way down here? And so in the third lecture, I talked about all the different kinds of things that influence this. And some of them are internal to the child. So some of them are the child's language aptitude, their sort of language intelligence abilities, their cognitive abilities for language learning. Some of us are better at this than others. And then there other internal things are whether the child is having socio-emotional well-being, whether their socio-emotional well-being is positive and good, or whether they're experiencing difficulties. That interferes with language learning. And then, of course, we have going outside the child, what languages they hear, how often, how rich their environment is. So the fourth lecture was on communication disorders and bilingualism, where these two meet. So there is a widespread common sense belief that children who have communication disorders should not be exposed to two languages. And so what happens is, especially parents who are immigrant parents often get counseled to use only the societal language. And there is a huge disconnect between these views and the actual research. So in my lecture, I showed from the actual research, a lot of it being my own, to show that children with communication disorders can and do become bilingual, and the capacity for bilingualism is there. Now, their language skills are just about as they become as good in each language as their monolingual peers in each language, which means not that great, but they don't have, there's no compromise to their overall language development, and there's enhanced well-being and family cohesion if they can continue to speak their heritage language. So sort of myth busting was the goal of lecture 4, to say, these kids can do it, they should do it, it's better for them if they do it, it's better for their families, that kind of thing. One of the things that was exciting about it being in touch with people from the lab, the director is Chaire, and they work with infants and toddlers, and they do a lot of in-lab experimental work, some of it quite complex, with event-related potentials, so brain electricity, and it's really, really interesting research. And all of my research is with bilingual children older than that age, and they do monolingual and bilingual children. So it's interesting to see what their perspectives are and their research findings are at this very, very early stage of bilingual exposure. And my research, which is more with older kids, more interfacing with questions that the school system, that clinicians might have about bilingual development in children. So we kind of are at different positions and different ways of doing things. I don't do anything in a lab. We go to the children in their homes, in the schools. It's all sort of field research. But I think that we have some interesting things in common in understanding how bilingualism unfolds. So I felt that I felt confident that I had some new things to present and new things to say and new ideas because they deal with quite different questions, different populations, different ways of setting up their research. So that was kind of fun.